You are worthless. The billionaire laughed, his voice echoing through the grand hallway like broken glass. The little girl, only 3 years old, didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply looked up at him with those huge, trusting eyes and held out a white envelope in her tiny hands. Inside that envelope was a DNA test, and in the next 60 seconds, everything the billionaire thought he knew about his life, his worth, and his future would shatter completely. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm really glad you clicked on this video. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching from. New York, London, California, wherever you are, I love seeing it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button right now, because we share stories to hear that actually touch your heart and stay with you long after the video ends. Stay with me until the very end of today's story. I promise, the final twist is something you won't see coming, and it will completely change how you feel about everything that happens. Some houses look perfect from the outside, but the people living inside know the real truth. The Harrington Estate sat atop a private hill just outside Boston, surrounded by tall iron gates, perfectly manicured lawns, and ancient oak trees that had stood there for over a century. From the winding driveway, it looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Stone walls covered in ivy, a fountain sparkling in the circular courtyard, and floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed golden in the evening light. Inside, the air always carried the scent of fresh lilies and expensive leather. But in the quiet back wing of that mansion, far from the formal rooms where important people gathered, lived a woman named Elena. At 31 years old, with dark hair usually pulled back in a simple ponytail and hands that were never idle, Elena had worked at the Harrington Estate for nearly 4 years. She woke before sunrise, polished marble floors that others walked across without a second glance, and moved through the house like a shadow. She never complained, not once. Every single thing she did was for one reason only: her daughter, Sophie. Sophie was 3 years old, tiny, curious, and full of a quiet joy that could light up the entire kitchen. She spent her days sitting on a small folded blanket in whatever room her mother was working, playing with a worn stuffed bunny she called Mr. Flops, watching everything with wide, wondering eyes. Elena had no family nearby to help, and Mr. Harrington, the billionaire who owned the entire estate, had always been quietly understanding about the little girl's presence. He never complained when he saw Sophie in the halls. Sometimes he would pause, look at her with something soft in his expression, and continue on his way. Elena noticed those moments, but she never dared to ask questions. When you need the job to survive, you stay silent. Everything had been carefully balanced, quiet and manageable, until 8 months ago, when Victoria arrived. Victoria Lang, 28 years old, stunning in that effortless way only certain women can be: sleek blonde hair, sharp blue eyes, and a smile that could charm or cut, depending on her mood. She had swept into the Harrington Estate like a storm. Within weeks, she was living there. Within months, she wore the massive engagement ring. The small staff quickly learned that Victoria had strong opinions about everything: the flowers, the lighting, the schedule, and especially about Sophie. "Why is that child always underfoot?" she had asked one evening, not even bothering to lower her voice. Elena had been standing just 10 feet away, hearing every word. The estate manager had tried to defend her gently, saying Sophie was quiet and caused no trouble. Victoria had simply replied, "This is not a daycare." Elena had lowered her eyes and said nothing, the way she had learned to do. Have you ever had to stay completely silent about something that broke your heart just to do you? If you have, then you already understand Elena better than any words I could say. But something was coming that even Elena's silence could not protect them from. On a cold Tuesday morning in late November, Victoria came downstairs earlier than usual, and Sophie was in the wrong place at the wrong time. What happened in that hallway would echo through the mansion for the rest of their lives. It started so innocently. Sophie had woken up early and wandered out of the kitchen in her little yellow socks with tiny ducks on them. She had found a shiny coin on the marble floor near the grand staircase. Nothing special to deck anyone else, but to a 3-year-old it was pure treasure. She picked it up carefully, her face lighting up with joy, and turned around right as Victoria came down the stairs in her silk robe, coffee in one hand and phone in the other. Sophie looked up and did what any trusting toddler would do. She held the coin out with both hands and said softly, "Pretty." For one brief second, something almost gentle flickered across Victoria's face, but it didn't last. "Where is your mother?" she snapped. Sophie's little lip began to tremble. Elena came rushing around the corner, apron still in her hands, eyes wide with fear. "Miss Lang, I'm so sorry." She only wandered for a moment. "This is exactly what I've been saying." Victoria cut her off, her voice turning ice cold. She set her coffee down sharply. "I am done with this. This is my home now. I did not sign up to live with a maid and her child running around like it's a playground." Her eyes moved between Elena and Sophie. Then she looked straight at the little girl and said the words that would change everything. "You are worthless. Both of you. Pack your things. I want you gone by tonight." The word worthless landed like a slap. Sophie flinched so hard she dropped the shiny coin. It clattered loudly on the marble floor. Elena immediately wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her close, her own face pale and shaking. "Please," she whispered. "She's only 3. But Victoria's face remained hard. "I don't care. Get out of my house." The entire hallway went deathly silent. Elena held her daughter tightly, heartbreaking. Everything she had built over 4 years, crumbling in front of her. And then, from the top of the grand staircase, came slow, heavy footsteps. The billionaire had heard every single word. The footsteps grew louder, slow, deliberate. Everyone in the hallway froze. Elena held Sophie tighter, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Victoria turned toward the staircase, her sharp expression softening just slightly into something more calculated. And then he appeared. Alexander Harrington, 32 years old, the man who had built a billion-dollar empire in tech and finance, before most people his age had even started their careers. Alexander was not the warmest man in any room. People called him brilliant, driven, sometimes even cold. He moved through the world with quiet intensity, always noticing things others missed. For 4 years he had noticed Elena, the way she worked without complaint, the quiet dignity she carried even while polishing silver and folding laundry no one would ever thank her for. And he had noticed Sophie too, those enormous brown eyes, the careful way she sat on her little blanket, the small, uncertain smile she sometimes gave him when he passed through the kitchen. He had always smiled back, though he never told anyone. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped onto the marble floor without rushing. His face was unreadable. Victoria spoke first. "Alex, I was just handling something that should have been handled months ago." He looked at her for a long moment, then walked straight past her toward Elena and Sophie. He crouched down slowly on the expensive marble, bringing himself to the little girl's eye level, one of the wealthiest men in the country, kneeling in front of a maid's child. Sophie peeked out from her mother's neck, still trembling. Alexander's voice was gentle when he spoke. "Hey, sweetheart, you dropped something." He picked up the shiny coin from the floor and held it out to her. Sophie stared at him for several seconds, then reached out with her tiny hand and took it. "Pretty," she whispered. "Yes," he replied softly. "It is." He stood up and turned to face Victoria. The silence in the hallway felt heavy enough to crush stone. "Elena and Sophie are not going anywhere," he said quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. Victoria's eyes widened. "You're choosing a maid and her child over your own fiancé?" Something complicated passed across Alexander's face, something old and buried. "I need to speak with Elena, alone," he said. "Please go upstairs." Victoria stared at him, stunned, but eventually turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. Once they were alone, Alexander looked at Elena. His voice dropped even lower. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes filled with tears. "Tell you what," she whispered. But the way her voice shook made it clear she already knew exactly what he meant. Alexander studied her face for a long moment, then looked down at Sophie, who had grown quiet in her mother's arms. "She has my mother's eyes," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "I noticed it months ago. I tried not to believe it, but I've been looking at those eyes my whole life." Tears began running silently down Elena's face. She held Sophie protectively, as if the truth itself might take her daughter away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to reach you when I found out I was pregnant. 3 times. The calls went to your assistant. The messages disappeared. I thought you didn't want us." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. "I never received them. I swear to you." He looked at Sophie again, this small child who carried half of his blood, half of his history. The weight of 4 lost years seemed to settle on his shoulders all at once. "She's mine, isn't she?" It wasn't really a question. Elena nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "Yes, she's yours." The hallway fell completely silent. Somewhere upstairs a door closed. Neither of them moved. In that moment, everything that had been hidden for years was finally coming into the light. But the real storm was only beginning. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy that it changed the way you moved through the world? Elena had carried this one for more than 3 years. First through her pregnancy alone, then through every quiet day working in the house of the man who didn't know he had a daughter. She had watched Alexander from the edges of rooms, wondering if he would ever see the truth. She had convinced herself it was better this way, safer. But now the truth was standing between them, small and 3 years old, holding a shiny coin in one hand and Mr. Flops in the other. What happened in the next 48 hours would test every person in that house. It would reveal who they truly were beneath the money, the power, and the carefully built walls. And it would start with a simple DNA test that a toddler had somehow found and decided to hand to the man who had just called her worthless. The morning had started like any other, until it didn't. Sophie had woken up earlier than usual, her little feet padding softly across the kitchen floor, in those yellow duck socks Elena had bought her last month. The mansion was still quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that only exists before the day fully begins. Sophie had wandered into the grand hallway, curious as always, and spotted something shiny on the marble floor near the bottom of the staircase. A silver coin that must have fallen from someone's pocket. To a 3-year-old, it was treasure. She crouched down, picked it up carefully with both hands, and her face lit up with pure delight. She stood, turned around, and walked straight into Victoria's path. Victoria was coming down the staircase in her cream silk robe, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, already scrolling through emails. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom, and looked down at the small child blocking her way. Sophie looked up, completely trusting, and held the coin out. "Pretty," she said softly, offering her new treasure like it was the most wonderful thing in the world. For the briefest second, something almost soft flickered across Victoria's perfectly made-up face, but it vanished instantly. "Where is your mother?" she asked sharply, not taking the coin. Sophie lowered her hands slowly, confused. Victoria's voice rose. "Where is your mother?" Sophie's bottom lip began to tremble. Elena came rushing around the corner from the kitchen, still holding a laundry basket, her eyes wide with panic. "Miss Lang, I'm so sorry. I only turned my back for a moment. She must have slipped out." Victoria set her coffee cup down on the hallway table with a sharp click. She turned fully toward both of them, her expression cold and controlled. "This is exactly what I've been talking about for months. This child has no business running around the main areas of this house. I have told you again and again." Elena stepped forward, voice shaking. "Please, I'll take her back right now. It won't happen again." "No," Victoria said firmly. "I am done having this conversation. This is my home now. I did not agree to share it with a maid and her child." Her eyes moved from Elena to Sophie and back again. Then she looked directly at the little girl and spoke the words that cut like a knife. "You are worthless. Both of you. Pack your things. I want you out of my house by tonight." The word worthless seemed to echo off the high ceilings. Sophie flinched so violently that she dropped the silver coin. It clattered loudly across the marble and rolled away into the silence. Elena instantly dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around her daughter, pulling Sophie's small body against her chest. Her own face had gone deathly pale. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking. "She's only 3 years old. She didn't mean any harm." "I don't care how old she is," Victoria replied, her voice like ice. "This ends today." Elena held Sophie tighter as the little girl buried her face in her mother's arms and went completely still, the terrifying stillness of a child who doesn't understand what's happening, but knows something is very wrong. The dropped coin lay abandoned on the floor between them. Nobody moved. The air in the grand hallway felt thick and heavy. Can you imagine what Elena was feeling in that moment? Standing there in the house where she had worked for 4 long years, holding her entire world in her arms, while everything she had built threatened to disappear. The fear, the helplessness, the quiet strength it took not to break down completely in front of the woman who had just destroyed her sense of safety. Just when the silence felt unbearable, those heavy footsteps began descending the grand staircase. Slow, deliberate, each step echoing louder than the last. Alexander Harrington had been at the top of those stairs long enough to hear everything. Every cruel word, every flinch, every plea. Victoria turned toward the sound, her posture shifting from triumphant to careful. Elena didn't dare look up. Sophie stayed hidden against her mother's shoulder, and Alexander came down, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the entire hallway the moment he reached the bottom. He walked past Victoria without a word and moved directly to Elena and Sophie. He crouched down once again on the cold marble floor, right there in his own mansion, and looked at the little girl who carried his blood. What he did next would change the lives of everyone in that house forever, and it all started with a simple question that would tear open years of secrets. Alexander Harrington reached the bottom of the staircase, and the entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. He walked straight past Victoria without looking at her, and stopped in front of Elena and Sophie. Without hesitation, he crouched down again on the marble floor until he was eye level with the frightened little girl. "Hey," he said gently, his deep voice soft. "You dropped something important." He picked up the silver coin from the floor and held it out in his palm. Sophie peeked out from her mother's neck, eyes red and puffy. She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took the coin back with her tiny fingers. "Pretty," she whispered again, voice barely audible. "Yeah," Alexander replied, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "It is pretty." He stayed crouched there for a few seconds longer, looking at Sophie with an expression no one in that house had ever seen on his face before. Then he stood up slowly and turned to face Victoria. "Elena and Sophie are not going anywhere," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of finality that came from a man who was used to his words becoming reality. "Not tonight. Not any night." Victoria's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're really choosing a maid and her child over your own fiancé? After everything?" Something complicated and old moved across Alexander's face, like a door opening to a room that had been closed for years. "I need you to go upstairs," he told her. "I need to speak with Elena, alone." Victoria stared at him for several long seconds, her jaw tight. For a moment it looked like she might argue, but something in his expression stopped her. She turned sharply and walked up the stairs, her heels echoing angrily until the sound disappeared. Once they were alone, Alexander looked at Elena. She was still on her knees, holding Sophie tightly, tears streaming down her face. He spoke gently, but directly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena's breath caught. She looked up at him, eyes full of fear and years of hidden pain. "Tell you what?" she whispered, though they both already knew the answer. Alexander glanced down at Sophie, who had grown quiet again in her mother's arms, still clutching the coin and her stuffed bunny. "She has my mother's eyes," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "I noticed it months ago. I tried not to believe it, but I've been looking at those eyes my whole life. She's mine, isn't she?" The words hung in the air between them. Elena closed her eyes as fresh tears fell. After a long silence, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Sophie is your daughter. The grand hallway became completely silent. Alexander stood there, absorbing the truth that had just changed his entire world. 4 years of quiet observations, small smiles, and unspoken feelings suddenly made heartbreaking sense. He had a daughter, a beautiful 3-year-old daughter he had been living under the same roof with, completely unaware. Elena's voice trembled as she continued. I tried to contact you when I found out I was pregnant. 3 times. I left messages. But your life was exploding. New company, investors, travel, everything moved so fast. When I never heard back, I thought, you didn't want us. So I took this job when it was offered. I didn't even know it was your house until my first day. After that, I was too scared to say anything. I just wanted to keep her safe. Alexander listened without interrupting, his face a mixture of shock, regret, and something deeper. Something that looked a lot like love. He looked down at Sophie again, this small miracle who had just handed him a truth he never expected. The little girl who had been called worthless only minutes earlier was, in fact, his own flesh and blood. He reached out slowly and gently touched Sophie's hair. The little girl didn't pull away. Instead, she watched him with those enormous eyes that carried his mother's legacy. In that quiet moment, something fundamental shifted inside Alexander Harrington. The billionaire who had built everything with his own hands suddenly understood that the most important thing in his life had been right here, under his roof, the entire time. But this was only the beginning. The revelations were far from over, and the next few hours would bring truths that would test everyone in ways none of them could have imagined. Alexander stood there in the grand hallway, the weight of 4 lost years pressing down on him. He looked at Elena, then at Sophie, and something in his chest tightened. Come with me, he said gently. We need to talk properly. He led them to his private study, a room filled with dark wood bookshelves and large windows overlooking the estate grounds. Elena sat on the leather couch, still holding Sophie, who had grown sleepy from all the emotion. Alexander pulled a chair close and sat across from them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he asked the question that had been burning inside him. Tell me everything. From the beginning. Elena took a deep breath and began. 4 years ago, before she worked at the Harrington Estate, she had been a catering server at high-end events in Boston. Alexander had been 28, already a rising star, but not yet the billionaire the world knew. They met at a charity gala, not in the glamorous main hall, but in a quiet service corridor, where both had escaped the crowd for different reasons. They talked for hours that night. Real talk, honest talk, the kind that rarely happens in such worlds. They saw each other 3 more times after that. Short, stolen moments filled with laughter and connection. Then Alexander's company exploded. Investors, international travel, endless meetings. His world became a whirlwind. And in the middle of that chaos, Elena discovered she was pregnant. I tried to reach you, she said quietly. I called the number you gave me. I left messages explaining everything. But they all went unanswered. I thought you had chosen your career over us. So I made the hardest decision of my life. To raise her alone. Alexander listened, his face pained. I never got those messages. My assistant at the time was overprotective and screened everything. He was fired later for other reasons, but by then it was too late. I had no idea. He looked at Sophie, who was now half asleep against her mother's chest. May I? He asked. Elena nodded. Alexander reached out and carefully took his daughter into his arms for the first time. Sophie stirred, looked up at him with those familiar eyes, and didn't cry. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her little dress and pulled out a folded white envelope. She held it out to him with both hands, the same way she had offered the coin earlier. For you, she said softly. Alexander took the envelope, confused. When he opened it, his hands began to shake. Inside was a DNA test result. The words were clear. Paternity probability, 99. 99.98%. Sophie was his. Tears filled his eyes as he looked from the paper to his daughter. How did you, he started, but Elena explained softly. Sophie had found the envelope earlier that morning while playing near Elena's things. In her innocent way, she must have decided to give it to the man she had seen around the house. The man who always smiled at her. In that moment, everything broke open. Alexander pulled Sophie closer and held her gently, as if afraid she might disappear. I'm so sorry, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. I missed everything. Her first steps, her first words, all of it. Elena watched them, her heart full of both pain and relief. She had carried this secret for so long, protecting her daughter the only way she knew how. Now the truth was finally out, and it felt both terrifying and freeing. But the revelations weren't finished. Alexander looked at Elena with new understanding. There's more, isn't there? He asked. I can see it in your eyes. Elena hesitated, then nodded. She told him about the difficult pregnancy, the lonely nights, the fear of raising a child while working multiple jobs. She told him about the day she applied for the job at the estate, never imagining whose house it was. And she told him how she had watched him for 4 years, wondering if he would ever see the truth in Sophie's eyes. Alexander listened to every word, holding his daughter the entire time. When Elena finished, he reached out and took her hand. You are not worthless, he said firmly. Neither of you. You are the strongest person I have ever known. The study fell quiet again. Outside, the November wind moved through the oak trees. Inside, a family that had been broken apart by silence was slowly beginning to find its way back together, but there was still one more person in the house whose hidden pain would soon come to light. Victoria. And what happened when Alexander finally confronted her would surprise everyone. 2 hours later, Victoria came downstairs. She had changed into elegant clothes, her makeup perfect, armor back in place. She found Alexander in his study, sitting at his desk but not working, just staring into space. Sophie now sleeping peacefully on the couch nearby, wrapped in a soft blanket. Tell me it isn't true, Victoria said from the doorway, her voice tight. Tell me that woman's child is not yours. Alexander looked up at her. The silence that followed was answer enough. Victoria let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound filled with disbelief and pain. 4 years, Alex. She worked in this house for 4 years and you never knew? I never received her messages, he said quietly. I swear to you. And when I looked at Sophie, those eyes, I should have known sooner. Victoria pressed her lips together. For the first time since the morning's explosion, her carefully built walls began to crack. Something raw and vulnerable moved across her face. She walked into the room and sat down across from him. I can't do this, she whispered. I can't live in a house with your child and her mother and pretend everything is normal. Alexander looked at her with genuine sadness. I'm not asking you to pretend, but I think there's something you haven't told me either. Victoria stiffened. She stared at him for a long time before her shoulders finally dropped. The strong, confident woman, who had screamed, "You are worthless," that morning, began to speak with a trembling voice. She told him the truth she had been carrying alone for 8 months. She had gone to a specialist in New York, quietly. The news had been devastating. Severe complications that made it very unlikely she would ever be able to have biological children. She had been carrying that grief in silence, terrified that if Alexander knew, he might see her differently. She had thrown herself into controlling the house, the staff, and especially Sophie, because every time she saw the little girl, it reminded her of what she might never have. I looked at Sophie, and I saw everything I was afraid of losing, Victoria admitted, tears finally falling. Instead of being kind, I became cruel. I'm sorry. Alexander listened without anger. He had spent the morning discovering he was a father. Now he sat listening to the woman he had planned to marry, share her deepest pain. Both of them were broken open in different ways. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are not evil. They are simply carrying heavy burdens in silence. Have you ever been angry at someone, only to later discover the grief they were hiding? It changes everything. For the first time in months, Alexander and Victoria spoke honestly. There were tears. There were apologies. There was the painful realization that they had loved each other, but had stopped truly seeing each other somewhere along the way. The arrival of Sophie and the truth about Elena had forced everything into the light. After a long conversation, Victoria made her decision. I need to move out, she said quietly. This isn't fair to any of us. You have a daughter who needs you. And I need time to figure out who I am without pretending everything is perfect. Alexander didn't try to stop her. He understood. When she stood to leave, she paused at the door and looked at the sleeping Sophie. Something in her expression softened completely. She walked over, crouched down, and gently brushed a strand of hair from the little girl's face. I'm sorry, she whispered to the sleeping child. You are not worthless. You are very loved. She stood up, looked at Alexander one last time, and walked out. The sound of her leaving echoed through the big house. Elena had been waiting quietly in the hallway. When Victoria passed her, the two women looked at each other. Victoria stopped for a moment. Then, surprisingly, she reached out and gave Elena a brief, awkward hug. Take care of them, she said softly, before walking out into the cold November afternoon. Elena stood there, feeling something complicated. Not triumph, but quiet compassion. The storm that had begun that morning with cruel words was slowly turning into something else, something closer to healing. But the real beginning of their new life was just starting. In the weeks that followed, the Harrington Estate became quieter, but in a different way. Victoria moved out gradually, with dignity, and without dramatic fights. She and Alexander had several long, honest conversations over those days, conversations they should have had months earlier. There were tears, apologies given and received, and the painful but necessary work of two people realizing they had loved each other, but had stopped truly seeing one another. When she left for the final time, Victoria stopped at the front door. She turned back and looked at Elena, who was standing in the hallway with Sophie. Victoria walked over, crouched down to Sophie's level, and pulled a small silver necklace from her pocket, a delicate piece with a tiny star pendant. She held it out to the little girl.